There is a battle of ideas happening in the Gulf, one that may determine the future of the region.
We are the oldest ally for North America and the Middle East.
And while Saudi Arabia and its crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, have received much of the attention for the blockade of Qatar, another crown prince, Mohammed bin Zayed, or MBZ, is in many ways the most important character in this story. He's the de facto ruler, the most powerful man in the United Arab Emirates, and his views on Qatar, Al Jazeera, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Iran have shaped much of the messaging used in the Gulf crisis. Over the past few years, these crown princes, MBS and MBZ, have amassed a lot of power and brought their countries closer together under a more assertive and hawkish foreign policy to fight terrorism and to push back on Iranian influence across the Middle East. And while this may resonate with Western policymakers, the approach has further destabilized the region, one that's still figuring out the legacy of the Arab Spring. The Saudi and Emirati governments supported the military coup that toppled Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, opting for their version of strongman stability over rapid democratic change. MBZ in particular has long considered Morsi's political party, the Muslim Brotherhood, a mortal enemy. It's one of the oldest and largest social and political movements in the Arab world, and believes that Islamic principles should regulate all aspects of public and personal life. And their calls for political activism and electoral legitimacy have often been considered a threat by monarchies, dictatorships, and semi-democracies in the region since they've wielded power at the ballot box. The party and its various ideological offshoots have millions of supporters across the Middle East and North Africa, as well as millions of critics, including the ruling circle in Abu Dhabi. They were rattled by the rise of Muslim Brotherhood-linked parties after the Arab Spring, after they participated in elections and served in parliaments and governments from Tunisia to Jordan and Kuwait. So this fault line over the different perspectives on the role of the Muslim Brotherhood has grown since the Arab Spring. Some countries engaged or at least tolerated populist movements, but the UAE went after them. In fact, MBZ has targeted the Muslim Brotherhood in his country since the 1990s, and the 9/11 attacks hit the UAE close to home. While 15 of the hijackers were Saudi, 2 Emiratis crashed United Airlines Flight 175 into the South Tower. And nearly all of the money that financed the 9/11 hijackers flowed through UAE banks and used UAE wire transfers. So after 9/11, the UAE criminalized money laundering and illicit fundraising and increased security cooperation with the United States. They also cracked down on what they identified as extremists, including Al-Islah, a non-violent social movement in the UAE, which MBZ saw as a political and existential threat since it was ideologically linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. His security services arrested their leaders, excluded them from public office, closed their charities, and even stripped some Emiratis of citizenship.
Human Rights Watch has talked about this. They called it a new low in the human rights record of the UAE.
Our threshold is quite low when we talk about extremism. For many countries, the definition of terror is that you have to carry a weapon and terrorize people. For us, it's far beyond that. We cannot tolerate even the smallest and the tiniest amount of terrorism.
Terrorism is political by definition, and powerful people use its definition the world over for political purposes. The UAE's broad definition of terrorists, which has dominated the media campaign throughout the blockade, is so out there, it's rejected by the US, EU, and the UN. And even though he doesn't speak openly about this topic, MBZ has often shared his views with US diplomats. During the Bush administration, MBZ often spoke about the supposed influence of the Brotherhood, from school curricula to the armed forces, where he identified them in the military and put them through a form of reverse brainwashing, and spoke of a desire to take them down in a way that they'd never come back. After the US invasion of Iraq, he blamed Al Jazeera for having a negative influence on the Arab public, saying that it underscored the problem that he sometimes has with a free media. While Iran has long been the UAE's top security threat, before the Arab Spring, MBZ spoke of the Muslim Brotherhood as a hidden force that stirs up the Arab public, rendering the traditional leaders of Arab society impotent. He spoke of the Brotherhood, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and Osama bin Laden in one breath, grouping them all as transnational threats posing as national movements. And he continued growing more suspicious of this network and of Qatar, telling U.S. diplomats in 2009 that he believed that Qatar was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that Al Jazeera, the most popular news channel in the Arab world, had a negative impact on his family. His son had apparently voiced some anti-Western views from, quote, watching too much Al Jazeera. So he sent him on a humanitarian aid trip to Ethiopia with the Red Cross to correct his views. The WikiLeaks cables describe a man who feels it's his duty as a father and a ruler to maintain the integrity of the UAE, and he paints the perceived threats against it with a broad brush. In 2014, his definition of terrorism was more widely accepted. After UAE President Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan had a stroke, MBZ became the de facto ruler. And the battle of ideas entered a new phase, as millions of dollars started flowing to PR firms, lobbyists, and neoconservative think tanks to sell his threat assessment. The UAE even started paying millions of dollars for Egypt's lobbying efforts in D.C. to amplify its voice in Washington. But the Obama administration wouldn't give the Emiratis the support they wanted to take more aggressive steps against their Gulf neighbor, even though the U.S. stood by its Saudi and Emirati allies in Egypt and Yemen. But those interests aligned under Donald Trump, who provided a golden opportunity for Abu Dhabi to take bolder measures. And thanks to WikiLeaks, we can now see how the language used by the Emiratis in private would later form the ideological backbone of the blockade on Qatar.